Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji. Welcome back to the next episode of the Deconstructed Woman podcast. This week, Joji and I wanted to sit down after reading Fortunes of Jaded Women, which was a book that we read in our book club. And the premise of it was that, and I won't give it away to some people who maybe out there want to read it, but the question came up of, do we become our mothers? Is that something that we work towards? Is it something that we work against? What does that look like for each of us? Are there certain aspects of our parents and our mothers in particular that we want to inherit? Are there certain things that we aspire to be like? Or do we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start from scratch? So we wanted to open up this dialogue. I think that it's a good topic that a lot of times we may not think about readily, but it's something that came up for us. So, Joji, let's talk about first impressions and kind of your thoughts, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So when I finished the book, I thought to myself, the book was a three generation sort of conversation story about women and how women in, now I can't remember if it was a Chinese family, and just how they related to each other at all the different levels of these generations. So there was a matriarch of the family and sort of her sisters and her relationship with her sisters, as well as their relationships with their children. And so the whole time you're reading about the conflicts that are happening between all these different characters, the matriarch and her sisters, as well as her conflicts with her own children and her sister's conflicts with their children. And a lot of it has to do with a very typical storyline of the kids want to do their own thing. They're experimenting. They are trying to separate from their families and their traditions. And the families are trying to hold them close and feel like they know what's best for their children and is trying to push them into one direction. And the kids are pushing against that as well as trying to figure out their route. But at the end of the story, this that's the question that I was left with. Oh, whatever we try to do, are we going to end up eventually becoming like our moms? And as I thought about that, my first reaction was, oh, I don't know about that. I'm not sure if I want to do that. But then I started thinking about it a little bit more neutrally. And I realized that why wouldn't we want to aspire to be like our moms? Our moms raised us, clothed us, fed us, made sure we were safe. And those are all things that we as mothers want to do for our kids. And so then it made me think about like, why was my original reaction like, ugh, I don't want that? And so I guess I'll bring you into that conversation, Alyssa. Like when you thought about that, how do you approach it? What was your gut reaction in the very like when we first talked about it? What did you think?
I think that I looked at the attributes of my mother in particular that I do want to encompass. I think that there was a lot of qualities in it. Interestingly enough, I don't know that I have really reflected on it. So I'm like pausing for a moment. I'm like, okay, let me think about like my mom. She didn't work from home necessarily, but her office was in our home. So I guess that is like working from home. But a lot of times, she was there for all of my activities. She was there for all of my performances in middle school and high school. She was traveling with us. She was very actively involved in mine and my sister's lives. And I think that's something that as a working mom, want to try to do, but I don't work from inside my home and I don't is she my parents own their own business, and so they had more flexible hours. And so I struggle with that and trying to find my own path of what that looks like because it's just different. And I wish that I could have it like that, but it's definitely a different dynamic than what she had. But I think my initial so to answer your question, my initial reaction was like, yeah, I wanna be just like her and that I'm invested in my kids and their activities and what they do. I think that as I've gotten older, I've seen your perspective of your mother changes. I think that a lot of times I appreciate the way that she did things. And there's times where I want to divert a little bit and say, oh, I'm going to try something different and see how that pans out. And so I think that there's a lot of that is what's happening for me as I'm thinking about this for the first time. But I think my initial reaction was positive, but I imagine that there's people out there who didn't have such a positive experience or an upbringing, and so maybe that does influence them saying, "Absolutely not. I wanna do things differently." And I think that I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting doing it differently, but I do think that we learn from how our parents parented us, and then we take the things that we thought worked or the structure that we liked, or, "Yeah, I want my kids to be successful, so I'm gonna ingrain in them that they need to have a good work ethic," for instance. Like, that was I was working from a very young age, standing on a crate in my parents' restaurant, helping them out. And so I think that for me, that work ethic has carried me a long way, and so that's something I would want to carry on to my kids. So I think it's positive.
Yeah. So I do a little bit of a trick question or a difficult question because I think developmentally as young girls, we really do identify with our moms when we're 5, 6, 7 years old. And our moms are in many ways our heroes and who we want to be like. I think every daughter thinks that her mom is beautiful and really admires their mom. And as you get older and you start having your own opinions, all of a sudden, maybe things are not as easy as it was. And then when you get older and you're trying to separate, then you have more differences and maybe you'll have more conflicts with your mom and maybe your dad, not just to carve out our moms. But then I think what ends up happening is that when you get married and you have children, I think then you go back to admiring everything your mom was able to do. My mom was also a working mom. She did not work in the home, but she had an important job. And from what I saw, she kept the house running and she was always at home for us. After we got home, she would get home soon after that. And she did a lot of things. And my dad was more of the person whose main responsibility was really to work. And then as he got older, he started cooking more and having more of those kinds of duties or contributing more to the family. And so I think that as I thought about my mom from a more objective perspective, I thought to myself, there are so many things I admired about my mom. She came to the US on her own. She really wasn't raised to be as strong as she was and have the courage to come halfway around the world, to come to a new country without her husband, her family with her. She had to find a job. She had to really set us up so that we could join her and creating a network for herself and be successful and then to save the money to bring us here. She was really had in certain ways an adventurous heart and had a lot of courage. She was the oldest and she really helped out her family quite a bit. And she left her family to study to become a nurse. And like she just challenged the norms of what the community around her said was okay for her. And she did a lot of things because she felt that was the way to help her family out and such. And she was a very strong woman. And she definitely was an independent thinker. And she just had the balance of it all. She wasn't perfect by any means. And there were lots of things about my mom that I would say, oh, I can specifically say these are things that I wouldn't want to mirror from my mom. But she wasn't a horrible person. She was actually a very kind person. A lot of people thought she was very compassionate and things like that. And I think as we get become adults, we see our parents with adult eyes and we see the good and the bad and you take what you need and you leave behind what doesn't may not work or create conflict for you and so you have to figure out a way to navigate some of those things but I did think about it and reach the conclusion that in the big scheme of things, sometimes I laugh at myself because even though I'm like 56 years old, sometimes in my head I'm only 25 or I'm only 20 or something. And then I have to be like, oh gosh, I have a 28-year-old child. Like I am more like my mom's age than I am what I think of my age when I was that age. And so it's humorous to me that I don't necessarily always identify as a 55 or 56-year-old person. But knowing where I am now, I do feel like she had a lot of admirable traits. And I don't know why my first reaction was, I don't know. But ultimately, as I got through all those conversations, I realized that if I am half as courageous as my mom, half as kind as my mom and giving, and she was really very much of a giver. She thought about everybody else in a lot of different ways, as she really was a very compassionate person. So, like, she was, besides the fact that she was my mom and there was those dynamics, I think that she really is somebody to admire. What else do you think goes into, like, how come we as women don't say, "Am I turning into my dad?" Why do we always focus on our moms, do you think?
I think that the main reason is because I have to pause because I'm like, in a lot of ways, I am very much like my father. Uh, there are certain aspects that I can reflect on and say, that was definitely me too. And just like his love of reading is something that he ingrained in me and that has carried through. And that's something that I ingrained for my kids. And that was something that I see handed down from him. But I think that because the mother's role, and it's bringing back a lot of different episodes that we've done in the past, we've talked about what happens when you're with your family and the dynamics of that. And I think that some of that is because we do feel like we're still our parents' children in some ways. But I think that we emulate what's similar to us. And we've talked about differences in children and how sometimes as a child's development or as they're developing, they or go towards the same sex parents. And so I think that there's a lot of ways in which we are integrated into that just developmentally. So I think that also I wouldn't say, oh, I want to be exactly like I have my daughter here saying mom 25 times. So as you can see, she's trying to be just like mom right now. So again, I'm going back to the developmental piece of it. So my 3-year-old who's here in the room with me, she wants to say hello to everybody. So she gets her baby doll when I'm nursing my 10-month-old, and she sits and nurses her 10 or not her 10-month-old, her baby doll. And so I think from a very young age, we're already accustomed to saying, I want to be like this person. So I think that probably plays a role in it in some ways. I'm not sure that I have the research to back that, but I definitely think that's something that comes into play.
Yeah, we've had many conversations about gender, versus birth order. We just had an episode on that last time. And so I do think that there is definitely a gender identification that happens, and we role model the figures in our life that most look like us. And gender would be a very good starting point, right? And we have the same body as our parents, as our moms. And so I do feel like that is one of the first things. And I think as human beings, we see patterns, right? So our bodies are the same and we may have long hair like our mom or short hair like our mom or things like that. And I think that as children, we're always evaluating and looking for some of those similarities to say, okay, who am I like? And I think there are some ways that we do that with our opposite parent as well. Like I definitely have done, I feel like I look more like my dad and I have a few more of his traits and I think my mom. And so I do feel like you do look at both parents and say, okay, what did I get what from? But for whatever reason, I think being a girl, I do think that we are more probably we're looking at similarities and differences with the parent that's the same gender. And I would suspect that boys have the same kind of identification with their fathers and the male figures in their family. Matter of fact, I feel like my grandson, I was his playmate and his buddy, but as he's getting older, I see him gravitating more towards my husband and just using different parts of his brain and wanting to play different games and things that I am probably not going to be as good at as his father is and his grandfather is. And so I do see that. And there's a little bit of a grieving for me about that because I really enjoyed having that role. And now I feel like, okay, he's identifying, which is very natural. It's age 4, 5, 6. where gender identification occurs. And so it's very natural, it's developmental. These things happen. But because I've only had a daughter, she and I have been close our whole lives. And so she was always my go-to girl and she and I was her go-to person. And so I think it's a little interesting for me having a grandson who is now going to be 5 and seeing the way that he's changing and his interests are changing and a new experience for me. But luckily we have a girl that I can play with and I get to relive that again. So it is interesting now, Alyssa, you have a son and so you can speak to have you noticed anything with him and how differently he may relate to you versus your husband?
I think I would say that it's probably the same as what you described. I think that he is now almost 7 years old. And so he's always been my shadow and always very close to me. And now he is starting to say, I want to go fishing with dad. I want to go do this with dad. And he's getting to that point where he wants to do more with his father with it, which I encourage him to do because I want to foster their relationship because I think that I have a very strong bond with all of my children. And I at some point say, I want them, thank you. I want them to be able to have good relationship with both of us. I definitely see that, but he definitely, if he gets an option to, okay, who do you want to go with? I'm going this place. Your dad's going this place. He'll almost 9 out of 10 times say, I want to go with you, mom. So I think that we have a very close bond, but I imagine as he gets older and into his preteen stages, I definitely think that may change. And I'm okay with that. I think that in some ways he'll always be my little boy, but I think that there's certain things that I don't do. I don't fish. I could, but I don't. I don't do there's just certain things that I think that he does um that my son gravitates towards and wants to do, and I welcome that kind of relationship for them.
Yeah. Do you think that I have an idea since I'm older than you are, but how do you think that your perception of your mom has changed like decade by decade? Do you feel like there's been like a different kind of a relationship at every stage or like every 10 years, I would say like 0 to 10, we know what that's 10 to 20 is it's a probably a lots of stuff going on. But then 20 to 30, 30 to 40, can you pinpoint how your relationship has changed with your mom?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's shifted. I think that I spent the a large majority of my 20s and 30s I call my mom every day and the conversations have shifted from me calling to say I have this dilemma, what do I do? Teach me your ways if you will. And her saying, okay, here's some ideas and a mentoring role that kind of shifted when I got a little bit older. And now when I call her, it's to be like, oh, the kids did this funny thing today, or yeah, we're going to this. It's more of like updates and checking in. And we don't have those same kind of conversations that I remember having when I was younger. So I think our relationship has changed in that it's just a different dynamic and it's a different conversation. And because I have the data point literally I think there's maybe a handful of days I haven't talked to her, but outside of that, we've talked for 40 years. When I lived under her roof, it was like check in every morning during breakfast and then I'll see you tonight, mom, and going from there. So I think that there's definitely a shift. I think that now I'm shifting a little bit to what is this going to look like? Looking at the other half of my life and the reality that my mom's not always going to be there. And so, what does that look like as she gets older? I'm going to move into a caretaker role at some point, not anytime soon, mom, in case you're listening to this. She's very adamant that age is just a number. So, it's just one of those things where I think I'm now kind of looking towards the latter part of my life and how that will shift and continue to modify our relationship. But I think at the end of the day, I'm still looking at, okay, how can I be more like her in some ways? She's very social. She's always the life of the party. She's got a lot of attributes that I'm like, oh, that's not something that I would necessarily say I am, but it's not necessarily something out of the possibility or realm of what I could be. So I think that there's a lot of ways I want to be like her, but I think it's definitely shifted to what are those qualities and am I doing it? How am I doing them now versus really focused on me when I was younger and now reflecting on how am I influencing others and what is it going to look like 10, 20 years from now?
Yeah, I was thinking about it as you were speaking, that there's a point where you do stop asking for advice and you start talking as two adult women. Obviously, your mom is always going to be your mom, but there's that sort of power dynamic or that hierarchy shifts a little bit and you're more on an equal footing. And then I feel as I watched my mom get into her older years, then what ends up happening is also that there's a little bit of a role reversal over time where you are now the responsible person and not necessarily physically or anything, but you're more involved with their care. Like you were talking about caregiving. And I've lost both my parents. And so at some point, you also are they're completely dependent on us as their children. And it's a very strange experience in terms of realizing that now you're responsible for somebody who is much older. I think as we're prepared to take care of our children, I don't know if we're ever fully mentally prepared to take care of our parents in the ways that they need us, which is so different than what our children need from us. And so that definitely is a hard place to be and to realize that, yeah, that they're human beings and they have a lifespan. And at some point, they're not going to be with you. And when that happens, and I think the hardest thing about it too is that you're actually parenting your children almost at the same time. You're also it's that sandwich generation where you're taking care of your children and you're also taking care of your parents. It's a very hard time. That was probably one of the most challenging periods of my life. And I'm not sure how it works out to have those two very stressful things happen at the same time. But it did for sure. And you have to navigate some of those things and figure out how to manage all of that. But I also think about my mom in her older years, and she was so active. My mom was also the belle of the party. She was Miss Sociability, which a lot of people say I am definitely like that, like her in that way, which I am. But she loved people, she loved activity, she loved physical fitness. She was doing like a swim boot camp until probably the last year of her life. She just really was a very active person. She didn't really like to sit still. She always felt like there was something to do. She loved gardening, which I love to do as well. And she really taught me that, like your mom, Melissa, like not, an age is only a number, and you can either let that control you or you can know what it is and just keep plugging along and doing what you want to do. I feel like if my mom had not had type 1 diabetes, that she would be one of the fittest people that I knew. But she was still the fittest person I knew. Her doctors were amazed at her physical abilities into her 70s. And so she was really quite a model of great behavior. She really managed her nutrition, and which is why she was able to live so long with type 1 diabetes. And ultimately, it did catch up with her. But what she taught me was how to live a long life, even when you have health conditions that you could just give into. And she never let her diabetes, she was insulin dependent since she was 18 years old. And so she really taught me that you can do everything you want to do and really live the life that you want and not let anything define you, and that you always have input into that. So even as she was in her older age, I think I was really, and I was at an age where I could see it and understand it for what it was, because that was a lot to admire. Never to feel sorry for yourself or feel like you couldn't do, like something could hold you back. My mom really challenged a lot of norms and a lot of social expectations by doing the things that she wanted to do. And she really didn't look back. She was very strong and strong willed in that way. Once she made a decision, she knew where she was going. As I think about it, I think this conversation has really made me flip to the point of I should be proud to be somewhat like my mom. She was an amazing woman, and she was the one who gave us the opportunity to come to the US, and she didn't let her fear stop her. And she came out here, made a life for herself, brought us here, created a life for us. And throughout her whole life, demonstrated being a strong woman is. And I remember telling her that when she was at the end of her life and she was feeling weak and giving up. And I told my mom, I said, "You are the strongest woman I know. Like, you have done so many things that you probably had no idea you were capable of. And don't give up now." And and I really meant every word of that. And it really is like a full circle moment for me. Actually very grateful for this conversation because it's making me realize how much of a powerhouse she was. And really, I hope that I'm like 1/8 of who she was because she was an amazing person. So I'm actually really excited about this conversation. I feel like I've really, gone from one extreme to another extreme. And I'm really glad to have landed where I am. Alyssa, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to contribute? I know I've been like realizing having these light bulbs going off in my head, but it's actually quite a beautiful experience.
Yeah, no, I love that for you. And I think that that's the point of this is that maybe somebody listening is also having that experience of had an initial reaction of, no, I don't want to be anything like my mom. But as you really sit down, I think both of us had that moment where we're like, okay, let me really think about this. What does this really mean? How does this look? And then you do, in some ways, there are things inevitably that you're going to come out of your mouth that you're like, oh, that was my mom. But I think that it's one of those evolutions as we get older. We're looking at where we've come from, where we want to go. And so our parents and loved ones and the family that we've created, those are the ones that influence us so much and why we try to impart so much on the next generations as well. So I think that it was a great conversation as well and really hopefully opened up that dialogue for those of you out there listening to us. And we would love to hear from you. As always, we are always welcoming comments on our platform, which is on Spotify. You can email us at the deconstructed woman podcast at gmail.com or jump into our Facebook group where you can, under the same name, the Deconstructed Woman podcast, get our episodes weekly. We post them up there. Sometimes it's a little backlogged, but we definitely try to post them as quickly as we can. And make sure that you jump into the conversation because that's what this is about. It's about reflecting where we're at in life, where we're going. And so thank you for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.